All right. So we are streaming live and recording. And thank you to Yossi for hosting. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. We are going to delve into the story of Korach, as we just finished saying, you know, the very, I would say, more than just coincidental incident of this sinkhole in Yerushalayim, and also, unfortunately, these tragic fires, which is also part of the Parsha, because God sends fire, we'll talk about that later, to wreak havoc on the rebels. But Korach is a fascinating personality, and I have no doubt that, and I'm not going to really get into politics. Next week I'll have my chance when I write a column next Friday, but I'm very saddened and shocked by what is going on here vis-a-vis the election and the things being said, which are really shocking and horrendous. I'm not going to get into it now, but I'm sure most people agree that some people are very makpid on what goes into their mouths, but not necessarily what comes out. And that's very sad. But that's for another subject. I'm sure that lots of people will have a field day sermonizing this Shabbat about Korach and, you know, the abuse of authority and standing up, you know, and going up against the power structure, etc. So we'll try to look at some of the, a little bit deeper into this whole story of Korach. On a broader sense, very tragic, because we are looking at the breakdown of Moshe Rabbeinu's authority and respect, which is truly disheartening. It's really coming in 3 parshiot in a row where you see this process of eating away at Moshe's authority. We saw it initially when the complaining spread among the general populace in Parshat Baalotcha, the mit onanim. And that was the nation at large complaining about lack of meat, lack of water, etc. And then in Parshat Shlach last week, we saw now the leadership of the nation, the creme de la creme, the representatives of all the tribes, the majority of them known colloquially as the Meraglim, and they come and basically stand up against Moshe and dispute his authority. And that has to be dealt with. So the nation, then the leadership, and now his own family. And it really doesn't get worse than that his own cousin is leading this rebellion against him. And he's in charge of this gang of malcontents. And essentially, at least on the surface, they all seem to have this common thread of feeling that they've somehow been cheated and disenfranchised. So along with Korach, who we'll come to in a second, you have Datan and Aviram. They are members of the tribe of Reuven. And so they feel Reuven is the firstborn. Why is he not getting, no pun intended, the lion's share of kavod and, you know, of leadership? Instead, that's going to Yehuda and to some extent to Yosef, because Yosef will get a double share in the land through Ephraim and Manasseh. And Reuven, well, he's basically, even when it comes time for the blessings, he's being castigated. And he doesn't get a very pleasant blessing at all. So his offspring, his descendants, Datan and Aviram, they feel that we've been cheated. And then you have the Bechorim. We know that the firstborn ones were in a leadership position in terms of carrying out the ritual practice of the nation. And then they are replaced by the Kohanim after the sin of the golden calf. Levi does not participate in Chet HaEgel. And so as a reward to them and a punishment to the others, to these firstborns who really had a privileged position at one time, they now are feeling we too have been disenfranchised. And so all of them are coming together in this assault on Moshe's authority. And what does Moshe do? And the pasuk says, "Vayipol al panav," he falls down on his face. And Rashi says, there are many ways to interpret this. Rashi brings the fact that he prays, and in a sense, he's been doing this. He doesn't want to see his nation fall apart, so he is praying. But I suggest that it's more despair than it is prayer. Despair, not prayer, because he's just been through the ringer. And he essentially just falls on his face. I mean, he kind of faints dead away, saying, how much of this can I really take? So the rebellion is led by Korach. And we have to ask the question, what is it that is motivating or bothering Korach? He seemingly is somebody who has it all. He was enormously rich. The Medrash says he may have been among the two richest people ever in terms of, vis-a-vis others, maybe not in terms of amounts. I don't know if he would be as rich necessarily as Jeff Bezos or Warren Buffett, but he was very, very wealthy. He had a prominent position. He is a member of Shevet Levi. Remember, he's cousins to Moshe and Aaron. And he was given the task of carrying the Aron Kodesh. So that's a very mechubad, that's a very honorable thing to do. And he gets to hobnob with all the elite. He's in that upper crust. But apparently it's not enough for him. And so he has to question God's choice of Aaron as Kohen Gadol for life and verbally attack Moshe and try to bring the whole system down. Now, I use the title for this talk, All in the Family, the Kohen Mutiny. For you old-timers out there, maybe you recognize the reference. All in the Family was one of the most famous TV shows. And then not the Kohen Mutiny, but the Cain Mutiny. And you remember that was quite a famous, fantastic movie. But here is the Kohen Mutiny. Okay, so if you got that, thank you. If not, well, what can I say? So why does Korach risk it all to lead this ill-fated rebellion? And the answer, Chazal seem to say quite clearly, is the one thing that he wants more of. It's not money. It's not necessarily yichus, your personal background. He wants power. He seeks this kind of absolute power. After achieving fame and wealth, position, and influence, there's only one threshold left to encounter, and that is power, the ability to make your own rules, to challenge all the norms, to flaunt the law shamelessly, and to dare society to make you back down. We've seen this before. We've seen this movie, so to speak, before with other people. We've seen it with presidents, especially those who have great power. They have wealth, they have influence, but they want to test the limits of power and overstep their boundaries. And that seems to be what's happening with Korach. He really wants to really test the limits. Now, he's very slick. I sometimes say that Korach connects to two words. One is kerach, which is ice. The other one is kereach, which means bald. In both cases, it seems to imply something which is slick or slippery. And, I could almost see Korach as being a nickname. He's very slick. And so he's got a very attractive, populist, egalitarian type approach. It's hard to argue with, right? He says to Moshe and Aaron, why are you monopolizing all the top positions. What's so special about you? Kol ha'edah kulam kedoshim. The entire Jewish nation is holy. Ubetocham Hashem. And inside each one is God. I mean, this is very potent stuff. And it appeals to the general public, perhaps, saying, you know, Moshe and Aaron, they're human beings. They're not any more holy than we are, so to speak. Of course, we would say they certainly have reached a very high spiritual level, so that's not really true. But essentially, maybe we should have a rotation system. And of course, maybe I should be first on that rotation system. And, you know, he uses this very attractive argument. And then he's not just slick in terms of his approach, but also his tactics. And the Medrash says he has his followers dress up in uniforms made out of techelet. Techelet is this indigo color. I'm not going to, there's a whole debate about what color it is, but we know that you tie the strand of techelet to the tzitzit. And by the way, it's interesting because it's very expensive. Techelet at one time was the color of kings. It was very royal. And it indicated wealth and power and prestige. So he has his followers wear clothes made all out of techelet. And then he says to Moshe, let me ask you a shaila. If your clothes are all made out of techelet already, do you have to have an extra strand of techelet on your tzitzit, on your talit? And his second question is, if I have a room filled with Sifrei Torah, do I have to have a mezuzah on that door? It seems extraneous. I already have a room full of Torah. Why do I need one little extra parchment? Of course, what he's asking, it's quite obvious. He's attacking Moshe in a subtle way by saying, again, you know, everyone's holy. So why are you special? Why are you any more holy? You're like that extra strand of techelet on an all techelet garment. But he's also, Chazal say, he's also attacking God as well by saying, you know, some of these laws are illogical. Why would I need a mezuzah on the door of a room filled with Torahs? And of course, our answer, and by asking that question, he's also, in a sense, confronting God and challenging God and saying, yeah, you may have chosen Moshe and Aaron, but is that really the right thing to do? Maybe, God, you should be a little bit more egalitarian and spread the wealth among others. So he kind of crosses a line here in terms of his attack on Moshe and Aaron, but it really is an attack on the whole system, as if to say there's a flaw in the system in general. He uses, it's fascinating. We see this kind of, if you look beneath the surface, this quid pro quo, because he uses this phrase, Rav lachem b'nei Levi. You've taken too much for yourself. You've bitten off too much. And Moshe comes back and he uses the same exact phrase. He says to them, Rav lachem, don't you tell me that I've gone too far. You've gone too far. Moshe, you know, he's feeling his oats. He's been through the ringer with this nation and now his own family. And he fell on his face, yeah, but he's picked himself up and he's gotten back in the ring. And they also use another phrase, both Korach or both the rebels and Moshe, because the rebels say, Hama'at ki aletanu me'eretz zavat chalav udvash, a real stinging comment, like, isn't it enough that you took us out of Egypt, a land of milk and honey? They know what they're saying. This is a put down, you know, of Moshe and God, who calls the land of Israel Eretz Chalav Udvash. And then Moshe uses the same phrase when he says, Hama'at lachem, right? Isn't it enough that you have been chosen for one of the elite positions to work and in the Mishkan and carry the Aron Kodesh? So, you see right in the text, this is not coincidental that Moshe and the rebels use the same phrases, because they're really kind of going at each other, and Moshe can hold his own. And in this Parsha, we see that Moshe goes out of character, where he is always defending the people and, always, in a sense, choosing the path of least resistance. But here he says to God, no, we've got to make an example of these people. We've got to do something to show that, as we say in Hebrew, ad kan v'lo yoter. There's only so far this rebellion can go. And so Moshe calls for this sinkhole or earthquake that ends up swallowing Korach, Datan, and Aviram. And in a sense, as the Medrash says, you opened your mouth against God. Now God will open the mouth of the earth and swallow you up. Mida keneged mida. And then the fire burns the other 250 rebels. So Moshe does something, and it's not the only time in history. It's interesting that, first of all, we have a commandment, lo tenasu et Hashem elokecha. Don't dare God. Don't test God. You're really not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to say to God, or say about God, I dare you to do this, or to say, to show that I'm right, God is going to do X, Y, and Z. That's generally not something that is allowed, but there are exceptions. And there is another exception to this idea of daring God. Some of you may know it if you know your Tanakh. And interestingly enough, it comes in the story of Korach's descendant. Korach's descendant is none other, someone who the Torah says is equal in his generation to Moshe. And that is none other than the second greatest prophet, Shmuel Hanavi. Shmuel does the same thing that Moshe does here. He also dares God in the whole story with the Nevi'ei Baal, the idolatrous prophets of Baal, where he says, we're going to have an experiment and we're going to test who is really authentic, just as Moshe does. Moshe says the story of the fire pans. Whoever's fire God lights, that's who God chooses. That's, in a sense, challenging God. You're not supposed to do it. Shmuel does the same thing, and also does it with fire, and says, whose ever offering is consumed by fire from heaven, this is the true prophet. So it's interesting that this scene is played out in two different generations with the same family. Because again, Korach's direct descendant is Shmuel. So he will do the same thing that in effect basically obliterated Korach by God proving that Moshe is correct. Moshe emet v'Torah to emet. Moshe is truth, his Torah is truth, which by tradition is a phrase that Korach and the rebels would scream at least once a year, if not more, from the depths of the earth. Moshe was right, his Torah is right. So all of this interplays in this very fascinating story of Korach. I want to add something that we'll see next week and talk more about, something that most people overlook in this Parsha, and that is that when the fire comes down, they have this test of the fire pans. The fire comes down from heaven. It consumes the 250 firstborn rebels and their fire pans. But then God says to Moshe, collect those fire pans, put them all together, melt them down, And that's what I want you to cover the Mizbeach with. In other words, I want you to actually, when you look at the Mizbeach that is meant to bring atonement, you will see this covering that came about when you went too far, people went too far in challenging Hashem. And it's very interesting that these things become a symbol. We'll see other examples of this, where in a sense, the people are told to come face to face with that which caused them to sin, or that which was their weakness, and overcome it by coming to grips with it in a very proactive and frontal way. So I'm mentioning it because we'll see this pursued next week as well. Now, how do we know that Korach's rebellion was not correct for all its high-minded sentiment? Really for two ways. Number one, we know the famous statement in Pirkei Avot. What is the definition of an argument, a machloket, that is for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim? That is Hillel and Shammai. Yes, they argued very strenuously against each other, but they did it l'shem shamayim, for good. And what is the example of an argument that is not for the sake of heaven, that is not legitimate? That is Korach and Va'adato, Korach and his cohorts. Now, okay, of course, the question that comes out right at you, it should have been Korach versus Moshe. Korach standing up against Moshe. Why does it say Korach and his fellow rebels? And the answer to that basically is, it was clear that even among that group itself, they were not happy with one another. There wasn't even a sense of unity and loyalty between Korach and his own rebels. So clearly that was a sign that, this is an ill-fated decision to try to usurp the authority of Moshe. The second thing that I want to say a word about, and it's one of my favorite subjects here, and that is the story of On. It's an interesting name. And what I call his unsung heroine, Mrs. On, because her name is never actually given. And yeah, I'm sorry. I see that correction about Eliyahu. Sorry, Eliyahu Hanavi. Right, does the other test. Yes, correct. Sorry. So her name is never given, Mrs. On. I call her basically in a league of her own because she is a spectacular person. And as the story goes, her husband is mentioned as one of the rebels, but later on, when the punishment comes, his name is missing. Why? So the Medrash tells the story that his wife saved him. She basically fed him, and this is very reminiscent of the story with Yael and Sisro, that she fed him wine and cheese. He fell asleep. And when it came time for the rebellion, the meeting with Moshe, Korach comes to get On from his tent, and his wife is sitting there with her hair uncovered, right? Because this is the married woman covers her hair. She had her hair uncovered. And Korach, being so righteous or self-righteous, he stops and he says, I can't go any further. I can't go into the tent because I can't come closer to someone who has her hair uncovered. And he turns around and leaves. Later on, when On gets up, she says to him, On, you're not going anywhere. This is a lose-lose proposition for you, she says. Because if Korach loses the challenge, then who knows what will happen to you? You're finished. And even if Korach wins, he's not going to share the wealth with you. He's a megalomaniac. He's going to keep it all for himself. You'll get nothing. So either way, you lose. In a sense, she says to On, Korach is out for his own good, not for On's good. And she convinces him not to participate, and he is saved. It's an interesting quid pro quo because the Medrash says that just as On's wife saved him, Korach's wife was the one who egged him on and said, "You're nothing. You're wealthy. You're prominent. And what position do they give you? They make you a schlepper that you have to schlep around the Aron Kodesh and makes it look like that's a menial job." And as I say, she eggs him on, but in the end, the yoke's on him because, sorry for the bad pun, because as we know, he loses everything. What I want to kind of sum up with is this comparison with Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai also fought, but they fought for truth. There's a beautiful essay actually by the late Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, that there is a difference between fighting for truth and fighting for power or fighting for victory. And Hillel and Shammai fight for truth. And that's why what they do is L'Shem Shamayim. And Ad Kedei Kach, even to the point where Hillel and Shammai, when they would debate a subject, they would listen carefully to the other side's viewpoint and rationale before they made their decision and gave their opinion. They listened to the other side. I mean, I hate to say this, but if you've ever seen people being interviewed, especially politicians, on Israeli TV, I mean, forget about hearing somebody else's side. Both sides are screaming at once. You can't hear what either side is saying. But Hillel and Shammai, they wanted the truth. So they said, we're happy to hear your side. Maybe you'll have a better argument than we will. But in the case of Korach, of course, and the rebels, they're not interested. That's why when Moshe goes out and calls to them, in other words, he is willing to very humbly say to them, let's talk about this. They say, nothing doing. We're not even going to talk to you about it. We don't want to hear your side, right? That's what the rebels say, Vayomru lo na'aleh, right? It's kind of brings us back to the Meraglim who said lo na'aleh. But here too, no, we're not going to go and discuss it with you. And Moshe basically concludes from that, if force is what you want and power is what you want, then let God show his power. Then do something, God, that's very powerful. And there's nothing more powerful than an earthquake. We should hopefully never live to see it. But even when you see 3 cars disappear in a sinkhole, that's pretty shocking, and not to mention an earthquake. And that essentially is what Moshe is saying. Give him back Mida Keneged Mida. Not to remind another movie, you can't handle the truth. You don't want the truth. You're just looking for power. And that's what Moshe says to Hashem. That's to answer him. So in conclusion, Korach is one of 6 people that has a Sedra named for him. And on the surface, it's a great honor. And but I would say in the end, it's also a Mida Keneged Mida, measure for measure, and seems divinely fitting. Korach he sacrificed everything to aggrandize his name. And so he got just what he asked for. His name is now immortalized for all time as the name and title of a Parsha. He is known to one and all. The only flaw in that, and the only footnote, is that he is not known as a hero, but as a heel. He was unhappy with his lot. He got a lot more than he bargained for. So in a sense, he's an example of someone who really overstepped the boundaries and is basically a dugma ishit, a human model of how not to proceed. So this is the story of Korach. It's a sad story. Moshe is vindicated, but the truth is that unfortunately we see that his authority has been challenged one time too many, and the handwriting is on the wall that it's going to take a new generation and new leadership to ultimately bring us into Israel. So Shabbat Shalom to everybody. If you have a comment or a question, a short one, you can unmute yourself and feel free if anybody wants to add or subtract to anything I've said. If not,
this week,
we'll see you again next week. Yes.
Okay. Shabbat Shalom.
Yehudit Spiro.
Shabbat Shalom.
I just want to mention one point that I would use whenever I would teach this Parsha. When Korach Moshe doesn't answer right away. He says, Boker. And I think it's good advice for all of us that when you feel aggravated about something or upset, sleep on it. Don't right away. And I think that's a problem in the world we live in right now with WhatsApp and everything. It's too easy to react to things that people say or do.
Okay.
If we would have thought about it even a few seconds more, we might not have done it.
That could be. Yes, that's a good point.
Okay.
It was very impetuous. But Moshe, again, you know, part of humility is patience. And he has a lot of patience. And, you know, he's kind of willing to see whether we can somehow straighten this out. He really prefers to do it in a, a kind and gentle fashion. In the end, of course, he realizes it can't be settled amicably. They won't have it. And, you know, he is standing up. Rav Leff likes to say that in the Shmona Esrei, at the end of Elokai Nitzar, it says, God, you know, keep me from saying anything. Nitzor Lishoni, hold me back from responding to those who, you know, attack me. But then later on in that same paragraph, it says, you know, God, break the plans of others. What happened there? So he says that in the beginning, it was a personal attack, but in the middle, it talks about God's authority being questioned. And when God's authority is questioned, that's a different story. Then you have to react much more strenuously in defense of Hashem, in defense of the Torah, much more so than you would do for your own personal self. There, Moshe could be humble, but when you're speaking about, and I say this too, and I said this last week when I wrote, in defense of Israel, in defense of the Jewish people, you can't be a shrinking violet. You have to speak up and you have to be vocal. When you're attacked personally, okay, you can be humble because at the end of the day, God will see it through. But when God is attacked, the Jewish people are attacked, Israel is attacked, then you have to step up and you cannot be meek and mild. I wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Thank 100%. You all for joining in. We'll see you,
Rabbi?
Bezrat Hashem, next week. Yes.
Shabbat Shalom. Okay.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. May the earth move under our feet.